Every car that reaches Sanibel Island passes through a toll booth at Punta Rasa, on the mainland side of a 3-mile causeway. The booth counts them. It has counted them since 1963. If you want to know how many people go to Sanibel, you don't need a survey. You need the ledger from that booth. Drive across today and nothing looks wrong. The water is the color of weak tea and turquoise at once. The beach still faces south, still catches the shells that made this island famous, still fills each morning with people bent at the waist, in the posture locals named the Sanibel Stoop. The wildlife refuge is open, the lighthouse is standing, then you look for a place to sleep. Before September of 2022, the islands offered roughly 2,600 short-term rental units. 1 year later, about 200 were operating. Sanibel's hotel inventory stood at 2,458 rooms. 3 years on, it had recovered to about 1,171. Restaurants people had eaten at for 30 years never reopened. The obvious explanation is a hurricane, and the hurricane is real, and we will get to it. But hold on to one detail first. In September of 2025, Sanibel opened a new beachfront hotel. Local officials marked the occasion, and the reason they marked it had nothing to do with the storm. It was the first newly constructed hotel on Sanibel Island in more than 4 decades. 40 years, not 4. And the storm was only 3 years old, which means that long before any wind came ashore, something on this island had already stopped building the places where visitors stay. Something had frozen the machinery of tourism in place while the beaches stayed beautiful and the demand stayed enormous. To understand why almost no one goes to Sanibel anymore, you have to understand why almost no one was ever allowed to. And that story starts with a man who drew cartoons for a living. J. Norwood Darling signed his work Ding, a compression of his own last name, and by the 1940s that signature was one of the most recognizable in American newspapers. 2 Pulitzer Prizes, a brief combative tenure running the Federal Biological Survey under Franklin Roosevelt. He invented the duck stamp, which is to say he invented the idea that hunters should pay for the wetlands they hunt over. He also wintered on a nearly empty barrier island off Fort Myers, reachable only by a boat run by 2 brothers named Kinsey. In the early 1940s, Darling learned that a large tract of Sanibel's interior, mangrove, seagrass flats, cordgrass marsh, was being lined up for sale to developers. He had no legal authority over it. What he had was access to people who did. He wrote, argued, and lobbied until the matter reached the desk of Harry Truman. And in 1945, an executive order created the Sanibel National Wildlife Refuge, over 6,000 acres, permanently removed from the market. Understand what that meant on the day it happened. Almost nothing. Sanibel had a few hundred year-round residents, no bridge, farms growing tomatoes and key limes, and a hurricane in 1926 that had salted the fields and ended agriculture as a serious business. Protecting 6,000 acres of mangrove in 1945 was like putting a fence around a desert. That detail matters more than it looks, and it matters for an arithmetical reason rather than a sentimental one. Sanibel is roughly 12 miles long and, in most places, less than 2 miles wide. Darling's refuge took the entire northern flank of it. Everything that would ever be argued about on this island, every permit, every condominium, every hotel room, every dollar, would now have to fit into what was left. The supply of Sanibel was capped in 1945. Demand had simply not arrived yet. It arrived 18 years later at 40 miles an hour in a Buick. Until 1963, getting a car to Sanibel meant getting it onto the Kinsey Brothers ferry. The crossing took about 45 minutes. The boat held a handful of vehicles. If the boat was full, you waited for the next one, and if the last one had gone, you waited for tomorrow. That inconvenience was not a flaw in the island's character. It was the island's character. Access was rationed by the capacity of a hull. Lee County ended the rationing on May 26, 1963, when it opened the Sanibel Causeway, 3 bridges hopping across 2 man-made islands paid for by a toll. What had been a half-day expedition became a 15-minute drive. The response was immediate and enormous. Land that had been unsellable was surveyed, platted, and sold, often to buyers who had never seen it. Population climbed. Construction crews came across the new bridge every morning. And because Sanibel was unincorporated, every decision about what could be built there was made in Fort Myers by county commissioners answering to a mainland electorate. Their vision for the island was not a secret. Lee County's zoning would have permitted somewhere in the range of 30,000 dwelling units and a population above 90,000 people. Plans circulated for a 4-lane expressway down the spine of the island. Condominium towers were approved directly on the frontal dunes, the strip of sand that stands between the Gulf and everything behind it. At the time, Sanibel's peak season population was about 12,000. The county was proposing to multiply the island by roughly 8, and it was not a bluff. A handful of buildings from that window still stand today, taller than anything permitted since, marooned above a skyline of palm tops. The physical evidence of a Sanibel that almost happened. The people watching this from inside the island had no legal standing to stop any of it. They were residents of a county, not citizens of a city. They could complain. They could not vote on it, unless they became somebody else. Porter Goss arrived on Sanibel in the early 1970s. He was a former CIA officer, still young, forced out of the field by a serious illness, and he came to the island for the reason most people came. It was quiet and the fishing was good. He was not the only one. 2 other former agency men had settled on the same island. In 1973, they did something that people trained in intelligence work might reasonably consider the natural first move in a conflict. They took control of the information. They started a newspaper, the Island Reporter. Week by week, the paper laid out what the county intended, what was being approved, and what the island would look like when it was finished. Then it published an editorial with a proposal in it. Sanibel should stop asking Lee County for mercy and incorporate as a city with home rule authority of its own. The county fought it. One commissioner wrote directly to island residents urging them to reject it. The local Chamber of Commerce campaigned against it on the entirely rational grounds that a city built to limit growth would limit their businesses too. On November 5th, 1974, more than 85% of Sanibel's registered voters turned out, a participation rate that most national elections never approach. The result was 689 to 394, 64%. Sanibel became a city. A month later, voters elected a 5-member council, and the council chose Porter Goss as mayor. He would go on to Congress and eventually to the directorship of the CIA, but the most consequential thing he ever did to a piece of American geography, he did in his first weeks in local office. The new city's opening act was to stop everything, a general moratorium on construction, effective immediately, while the island figured out what it actually wanted. That bought time. It did not answer the question. Nobody on the council knew how many houses an island is supposed to have, so they hired people to calculate it. The city brought in a Philadelphia planning firm and a Chicago law firm and did something almost no American municipality had done. It started not with a projection of growth, but with an inventory of the land itself. Sanibel was divided into 6 ecological zones: Gulf Beach, Beach Ridge, Interior Wetlands, Mid-Island Ridge, Mangrove, Bay Beach, and each zone was assigned a development intensity it could tolerate. Density would follow ecology instead of ambition. But ecology was not the constraint that set the ceiling. The ceiling was set by evacuation. The planners asked a question that, in 1976, was closer to a thought experiment than a memory. If a major hurricane came for this island, how many people could physically leave it in the time available, across one 2-lane causeway? Whatever that number was, the island could not hold more. On July 19, 1976, the city of Sanibel adopted the plan and lifted the moratorium. The maximum was set at roughly 8,000 residential dwelling units, against the 30,000 the county had been prepared to allow. Buildings would be low, in most zones, essentially a story and a half, with nothing rising above the palms. No neon, no billboards, no high-rises, ever. And in a decision that visitors still notice within 90 seconds of arriving, no traffic lights anywhere on the island. This deserves a pause. Sanibel had just written the defining document of its future, and the load-bearing calculation inside that document was a hurricane. Not a projected hurricane in any particular year, a hypothetical one. The city's entire legal architecture, its property values, its beauty, its scarcity, everything that would happen to it for the next 50 years, rested on an estimate of how quickly Sanibel could be emptied. They were building a place designed around its own evacuation. And it worked. That is the part people forget. The Sanibel Plan became a landmark in American land use law, studied and copied, held up as proof that a community could choose not to become Miami Beach. Florida passed its own comprehensive planning act while Sanibel's ink was still wet. The island had won. The consequences of winning took about 30 years to become visible. Here is what a hard cap on supply does to a place that everybody wants. Through the 1980s and 1990s, Sanibel filled its allotment slowly, lot by lot, permit by permit, under a code that made every project smaller and more expensive than it would have been anywhere else in Florida. Each unit built made the next remaining lot rarer. Each rarity increased the price. Each price increase changed who could afford to arrive. The island did not gentrify by accident. It gentrified by ordinance. And the effect landed hardest on a category of building that the plan had never set out to punish: places for visitors to stay. You could not build a new resort on Sanibel. Not a tower, not a 100-room hotel, not a chain. The result was that the island's entire visitor capacity froze at roughly whatever existed in 1976. A scattering of small inns, cottage courts, family motels, and low-slung mid-century condominium complexes, most of them built in the 15 years after the causeway opened, most of them sitting flat on the ground behind the dune line. Remember those buildings? Everything turns on them later. Meanwhile, the island's fame kept growing, entirely disconnected from its ability to house anyone. Darling's Refuge, renamed in his honor in 1967, 9 years after he stopped drawing, was drawing more than 800,000 visitors a year by the mid-1970s, and it required nothing of them but a car and a few hours. The Shells did the same. Sanibel's east-west orientation acts as a scoop in the Gulf, and it delivered a world-class attraction that no one had to build, maintain, or permit. So the island arrived at a strange equilibrium. It had a globally famous product, an economy almost entirely dependent on tourism, and a legal commitment to never expand the tourism it depended on. The day trippers came. The residents grew wealthier. The population settled around 6,000 or 7,000 on an island where a majority of the housing units eventually stood empty most of the year, held by owners who used them for a few weeks in winter. An island of houses waiting for people. And in that condition, famous, fragile, dependent, and unable to grow, Sanibel met the first thing that could take its visitors away without touching a single building. In 2018, the Gulf turned. A red tide bloom settled along southwest Florida and refused to leave, running roughly 16 months, amplified by nutrient-heavy discharges pushed west out of Lake Okeechobee. On Sanibel, the beach that had built the island's entire reputation filled with dead fish. Then dead eels, dead rays, dead dolphins. The air itself burned people's throats, which meant even a healthy person standing on the sand had a physical reason to leave. Businesses on the island reported the season vanishing in real time. Rentals were canceled by people who had come every winter for 20 years. Restaurants that had never had an empty February had one. Nothing was destroyed. Not a roof, not a wall, not a road. And the visitors still stopped coming. That was the first proof that Sanibel's economy could fail without any physical damage at all. That the island's dependence on a single seasonal migration of tourists was a structural exposure, not a detail. The bloom eventually dissipated. The visitors came back. The lesson was noted, discussed at council meetings, and then, in the way of good seasons following bad ones, largely set aside. 4 years later, the physical damage arrived too. Hurricane Ian came ashore on the afternoon of September 28, 2022, near Cayo Costa, a few miles up the coast, with winds around 150 miles per hour, a Category 4 at the edge of Category 5. It would kill roughly 150 people in Florida and cause more than $110 billion in damage. placing it among the costliest disasters in American history. Sanibel sat on the southern side of the eye. That is the wrong side. The storm surge came from the Gulf, crossed the beach, crossed the dune, and crossed the island. Ground floor units filled, restaurants folded. The 1884 lighthouse lost a leg and stayed standing anyway. Then the Gulf did the thing that no plan had accounted for. The causeway, those 3 bridges hopping across 2 man-made islands, was built on fill. Surge scoured the fill out from under the approaches and took whole sections of roadway with it. The bridges survived. The ground between them did not. For the first time since 1963, Sanibel Island was unreachable by car. People who had ridden out the storm were taken off by boat and by helicopter. The island returned, overnight, to the condition it had lived in for its entire history before the causeway, reachable only by water, with everything and everyone rationed by hull capacity. The state rebuilt an emergency roadway in about 3 weeks, an extraordinary piece of engineering by any measure, and residents drove home in October to see what was left. What was left was the beginning of the actual story, because Sanibel was not destroyed. Sanibel was damaged. And on this particular island, that distinction turned out to matter far more than anyone expected. There is a provision in federal flood policy known informally as the 50% rule. It is not complicated. If the cost of repairing a damaged building reaches or exceeds 50% of that building's market value, the structure alone, not the land under it, then the building cannot simply be repaired. It must be brought into compliance with current flood regulations. In practice, on a barrier island, that means the whole thing has to be lifted above the base flood elevation or torn down and rebuilt above it. The rule exists for a good reason. It is how the country stops rebuilding the same house in the same hole forever. Now apply it to Sanibel. FEMA issued Sanibel's flood maps in 1979. Any structure built before then, sitting at ground level, as almost everything on this island did, was already non-conforming. And those pre-1979 ground-level buildings were not distributed randomly. They were precisely the stock that the 1976 plan had frozen in place. The small inns, the cottage courts, the family motels, the modest 2-story condominium clusters built in the causeway boom. The exact buildings that made Sanibel affordable to ordinary visitors were the exact buildings the water reached first and the exact buildings the rule condemned. Their owners were left with 3 options. Repair below the threshold, which for a flooded ground-level structure is often impossible. Elevate it at a cost that frequently exceeds what the building is worth. Or demolish it. And then comes the part that closes the circle. Whatever replaces a demolished building on Sanibel must comply with the Sanibel plan. Low, small, within the density assigned to its ecological zone. You cannot recover the economics of an elevated rebuild by adding rooms, because adding rooms is the one thing this island has forbidden since 1976. So the rational move, for a great many owners, was to sell the land, or to replace a 12-unit motel with a single elevated house. Follow the arithmetic all the way down. A 12-unit motel might host 40 or 50 different families in a year. The house that replaces it hosts one, for a few weeks each winter. The hurricane did not remove the visitors from Sanibel. The hurricane removed the places for visitors, and a 50-year-old commitment to never build more of them made the removal permanent. The rest followed the way water follows a slope. Condominium associations facing structural repairs met a Florida insurance market in the middle of its own collapse, and new state law, written after a tower fell in Surfside in 2021, requiring inspections and fully funded reserves. Special assessments ran into 6 figures per unit. Owners who had planned to keep a place for their grandchildren sold instead. Buildings sat gutted for years, waiting on money that had to be voted before it could be spent, and every year they hosted nobody. In September of 2024, Hurricane Helene pushed surge across the same beaches. 2 weeks later, Milton did it again. Properties that had just finished repairs reflooded, and the clock they had been running against for 2 years reset. The counting was blunt. 1 year after Ian, the chamber estimated that about 4% of Sanibel's tourism capacity was back online. Short-term rentals stood near 200, against roughly 600 before. By early 2024, a quarter of member businesses had reopened. By early 2025, about half. By the autumn of 2025, roughly 72%, leaving the hardest quarter still shuttered, the ones whose problems were structural rather than cosmetic. Hotel rooms had climbed back to about 1,671 of the original 2,458. Nature, meanwhile, recovered almost immediately. Within weeks of Ian, once the debris was cleared, the beaches were white again and covered in shells. The refuge reopened. The birds returned in their tens of thousands. That is the strangest fact in this entire story, and it belongs to Ding Darling. The part of Sanibel that was protected in 1945 healed itself in a season. The part built by people took years, and a great deal of it is never coming back at all. Return to the toll booth. People still go to Sanibel. They cross that causeway by the thousands, walk the beach, drive the refuge loop, stoop for shells, and go home the same day. Because for a growing share of them, going home the same day is the only option on offer. The island was never emptied. It was narrowed. And every narrowing was a decision someone made for a defensible reason. A cartoonist protected 6,000 acres from developers and fixed the island's supply forever. A county built a bridge and destroyed the natural rationing that had defined the place. A newspaperman turned mayor and 689 voters seized control from that county because the alternative was 90,000 people on a sandbar. Planners capped the island at 8,000 homes, using an evacuation model as their measuring stick, and in doing so froze its visitor lodging at whatever happened to exist in 1976. Scarcity made the island valuable, value made it private. Then the storm that the 1976 plan had imagined as a hypothetical arrived in fact and destroyed the low, old, cheap ground-level buildings first, and a federal rule and a local code, both written to protect the island, agreed that those buildings should not be replaced with anything like themselves. Sanibel spent 50 years engineering a limit on how many people could be on this island at once. In 2022, the Gulf enforced it. There is a version of this island where none of that happened, where the county got its expressway and its 30,000 units, where the towers went up on the frontal dunes, and where Ian, on the afternoon of September 28th, found 90,000 people trying to leave across a single causeway that was about to wash away beneath them. Sanibel chose the other version. It is quieter now, and emptier, and more beautiful than almost anywhere else in Florida, and increasingly it belongs to people who own it rather than people who visit it. That was not the plan, but it was, from the beginning, the arithmetic.